On April 18th, I discovered just how perilous it can be when a privileged heir believes the world revolves around him. It began like any other Thursday. I was at my desk by 7 a.m., coffee in hand, sorting through the quarterly reports for our most significant client, the one who had practically rescued the company from bankruptcy last year. That's when the door burst open. In strode Nathaniel Carter, 19 years old, the CEO's son, heir to a company he'd never genuinely worked for. His designer suit hung awkwardly on his lanky frame, his eyes alight with the kind of rage only a pampered child can summon when denied. "You think you can ignore me?" he snarled, slamming his fist on my desk. "When I give an order, you follow it." I remained seated, composed and professional. "Nathaniel, I don't take orders from interns." His face flushed crimson. "I'm the future CEO. You'll regret this." I simply raised an eyebrow. "Then I'll deal with you when you're actually the CEO. Until then," I motioned politely toward the door, "please leave my office." I knew that dismissing him would have repercussions. I just didn't anticipate them hitting that very night. Let me rewind a few months to when our CEO, Richard Carter, announced his son would be joining the company for experience. Most of us assumed Nathaniel would spend a few weeks shadowing departments before getting bored and retreating to whatever luxury resort he'd emerged from. We were mistaken. Nathaniel was handed the title of Junior Operations Director, a position I'd earned after 5 years of relentless effort and late nights with no real qualifications or understanding of our company's workings. In his mind, this somehow meant I was subservient to him. Initially, I humored him. I quietly corrected his errors. I salvaged his disastrous proposals before they reached clients. I even covered for him when he missed deadlines. Why? Because I valued my career. Because I believed in this company. And perhaps, because I hoped he'd mature. I was wrong about that, too. The breaking point arrived 2 weeks before that Thursday morning. Nathaniel stormed into my office, threw a file onto my desk, and declared, "Fire the Johnson team." They annoyed me. The Johnson team, my team, had just secured a $3.5 million contract for the company. "I'm not firing anyone because they annoyed you," I stated, my voice steady. His retort, "I'll tell my father you refused a direct order." I met his gaze without a flicker. "Go ahead." He stormed out. I thought that would be the end of it. Thought his father would instill some sense into him, but I'd underestimated the extent of his entitlement. On the night of the annual spring gala, I was representing our international clients, the very division I'd built from the ground up over 6 years. Everything felt perfect. The venue sparkled. The investors were pleased. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe hard work truly mattered. Then my phone buzzed. A single text from Richard Carter. "Claire, please come to my office first thing tomorrow morning." My stomach clenched. I barely slept. By 7:30 a.m., I stood before Richard's desk. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Claire, I'm afraid I have to. .. Before he could finish, I leaned in. "Check your inbox first." His face went ashen, because what he didn't know was that I had been meticulously documenting everything. Richard Carter stared at his screen as if it were a live grenade. The color drained from his face. He clicked once, twice, opening the folder I'd discreetly sent him the night before. Inside were 43 forwarded emails, every single one from Nathaniel. Some were laughable, some verged on illegal. There was Nathaniel ordering departments to falsify delivery reports. Nathaniel demanding the finance team manipulate numbers to inflate his forecasts. Nathaniel emailing me directly with gems like, "Just do what I say or I'll make sure you're out." I stood silently, letting Richard absorb it. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a deep sigh escaping his lips. I had no idea. I folded my arms. "Didn't you?" He flinched. The truth was, he had known. At least part of it. But turning a blind eye is simpler when it's your golden boy misbehaving. Simpler until the irrefutable proof lands in your inbox. Richard buried his head in his hands. "Claire, why didn't you come to me sooner?" I kept my voice even. "Because I thought this company valued merit, and because I didn't want to be the reason your family imploded." He looked up, his eyes sharp, a mix of guilt and fear. "My board can never see this." I gave him a stern look. "I'm not here to threaten you, Richard. I'm here because your son walked into my office yesterday morning and demanded I fire a team that just saved you $3.5 million. And when I refused, he vowed to destroy my career." I paused, letting that sink in. "I came here because I won't let a 19-year-old brat treat people like garbage while you look the other way. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the air conditioner. Then Richard whispered, "What do you want?" I smiled faintly. "I want my career. I want the Johnson team protected. I want this nonsense to stop before it blows up in your face. And Nathaniel, that's your problem." I left Richard's office, my heart pounding. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about justice, about ensuring hard work still mattered. But by Monday morning, I realized Nathaniel wasn't going to let it go. It started with whispers. Emails I was suddenly excluded from. Meetings rescheduled without me. Budget approvals delayed. The subtle art of corporate sabotage. I caught Nathaniel smirking outside a strategy meeting I'd been barred from. He actually winked at me. Here's the thing about entitled people like Nathaniel. They think power is a game they can rig. What they never grasp is that sometimes, the people they try to crush are the very ones holding the foundation together. A week later, Richard summoned me again. "You're right," he said quietly. "Nathaniel's out of control." I raised an eyebrow. "Good, so, you've spoken with him." Richard looked away. "I tried. He won't listen. He told me if I don't get rid of you, he'll go to the board and cause trouble." I actually laughed. 19 years old and threatening board action. Impressive. Richard didn't laugh. "Claire, I'm afraid I have to suspend you temporarily, just to calm him down. It's not personal." I stared at him, stone-faced. "It's never personal, is it?" He winced. "I'll make it right, I promise." But I already knew he wouldn't stand up to his son. He was going to sacrifice me, the person who built his international division, because it was the path of least resistance. I nodded politely and walked out of his office, head held high, but I wasn't defeated, because Richard had no idea. I'd been preparing for this moment for months. Walking out of Richard Carter's office that morning, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I'd learned long ago that in the corporate world, loyalty often dissolves under pressure, especially when family is involved. But what Nathaniel and his father didn't realize was that I wasn't standing alone. While they were busy plotting my exit, I'd been building something entirely different. 3 months before Nathaniel stormed into my office, I'd noticed shifts. Clients were becoming uneasy. Senior managers asked odd questions, and several high-level partnerships, ones I had personally negotiated, were suddenly being reassigned. It didn't take a genius to realize Nathaniel was positioning himself. He wanted to control the international division I'd built from scratch, and Richard was allowing it. So, I did the one thing they didn't expect. I started documenting everything, every email, every meeting note, every client concern about Nathaniel's behavior. I had a clean, organized record of every reckless decision he made and every cover-up attempt Richard permitted. But I wasn't foolish enough to keep that information to myself. I reached out to 2 people I trusted implicitly within the company, Marta Chen, our head of compliance, and David Alvarez, our senior legal counsel. Both had worked alongside me for years. Both had quietly voiced concerns about Nathaniel's conduct. Over coffee, off the record, I laid out everything I had. At first, Marta shook her head. "Claire, this is a career-ending mess." David agreed. "If the board sees this, I met their eyes. They need to see this, not for me, for the company." There was a long pause. Then Marta leaned in. "I'm with you." David nodded. "Me, too." That's when the real work began. We spent late nights cross-referencing contracts Nathaniel had tampered with. We tracked compliance violations that could have triggered investigations. David drafted confidential memos outlining potential breaches of fiduciary duty and who could be held responsible. Marta discovered that one of Nathaniel's special projects had nearly put us in violation of international trade laws. Had I not intervened quietly 2 months earlier, the fallout could have sunk the company. By the time Richard called me in to suspend me, I wasn't worried. Because the board wasn't going to hear about Nathaniel's misconduct from me. They were going to hear it from their own compliance and legal departments. But that wasn't all. The final piece of the puzzle was our largest international client, Eastbridge Global Holdings. I'd cultivated that relationship personally, and I knew for a fact they had serious concerns about Nathaniel after a disastrous meeting he'd led without me. So, I reached out to Michelle Tan, their head of partnerships. We met for lunch. No pressure, no agenda. But when I casually inquired about their plans for future contracts, Michelle gave me a knowing look. "Claire, off the record, if you're gone, so are we." I blinked. Seriously? She nodded. We don't work with companies run by amateurs. That was all I needed. By the time my suspension hit the internal email list, two things happened simultaneously. Marta and David submitted their joint report directly to the board. And Eastbridge Global sent a formal letter of concern to Richard Carter with a not-so-subtle warning about withdrawing future business if leadership changes weren't made. I wish I could say I felt triumphant. But honestly, I just felt ready. Because Nathaniel Carter had spent months thinking he could push me out with empty threats and childish tantrums. What he didn't understand was simple. You can't bully people who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The official notice hit company-wide email at 9:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Claire Patterson. Administrative leave. Pending internal review. No explanation, no details, just a cold, sterile sentence announcing that I was, for all intents and purposes, out. But what Richard Carter didn't know was that the review had already started, and it wasn't about me. At 10:05 a.m., Marta and David submitted their joint report directly to the board of directors. It wasn't dramatic. No accusations, no finger-pointing, just cold, hard facts. Nathaniel Carter had attempted to manipulate financial data on multiple occasions. He had issued directives outside of his authority, risking contractual violations. He had interfered with compliance procedures, and Richard Carter, by omission or willful ignorance, had allowed it to continue. The report ended with a simple recommendation. We advise immediate review of leadership, accountability, and potential breaches of fiduciary duty. By 11:30 a.m., the boardroom was in lockdown. I wasn't there, of course, but Marta kept me updated, via text. Richard looks like he's aged 10 years in an hour. Nathaniel tried to blame you. Didn't go well. Board isn't buying it. They want answers. I read every message with a strange sense of calm. I hadn't leaked anything to the board myself. I hadn't gone public. I didn't have to. The truth had its own way of rising. Around 2 p.m., Richard called me. I let it go to voicemail. He tried again. By the third call, I picked up. Claire, I think we need to talk. I let him sweat for a moment, not about my suspension, but about everything. We met in his office late that afternoon. For once, Nathaniel wasn't hovering in the background. Richard looked hollow. The confident CEO mask was gone. The board wants to meet with you tomorrow morning, he said quietly. I nodded. And, he hesitated, they've asked for Nathaniel's immediate resignation and for me to step down temporarily, pending review. I didn't flinch. Sounds appropriate. Richard gave me a bitter smile. You really did it. You destroyed him. I met his gaze steadily. I didn't destroy anyone. Nathaniel did that himself. I just refused to cover it up. For a moment, I thought he'd explode, but instead, he slumped forward. You were the best we had, he whispered. I should have backed you. I stayed silent, because in that moment, there was nothing left to say. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom I'd never been invited to before. 12 directors, cold eyes, serious faces. But when I sat down, something shifted. They didn't grill me. They didn't accuse. They asked for my perspective. And I gave it to them professionally, calmly, backed with facts. I told them about the deals I'd negotiated, the partnerships I'd protected, the risks I'd mitigated that Nathaniel's recklessness had created. I watched as heads nodded around the table. By the end of that meeting, the chairman leaned forward. Claire, we'd like you to consider stepping into an interim leadership role for the international division, while we restructure. I could hardly believe it. I wasn't just reinstated. I was promoted. But even as I shook hands and smiled politely, a part of me remained guarded, because promotions come and go. Titles shift, power is temporary. But respect, that's earned, and it's the one thing Nathaniel Carter would never reclaim. 2 weeks after that board meeting, Nathaniel Carter was gone. No farewell email, no announcement, just gone. I heard whispers he'd been shipped off to manage family investments overseas. In other words, they quietly banished him to avoid scandal. And Richard Carter. He stepped down voluntarily, citing personal reasons. The company's internal memo thanked him for his service and highlighted his commitment to future transition efforts. Corporate Speak 4. We won't fire you publicly if you disappear quietly. On my first official day as interim director of international operations, I walked past Nathaniel's old corner office, empty, just a nameplate lying on the desk. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. Because this wasn't about proving a point. It was about protecting the people who'd been risking their careers under his chaotic shadow. I called my team together for a meeting. No fancy speeches, no victory laps, just one simple promise. I don't care about titles or last names. I care about work, integrity, and respect. That's how we move forward together. And for the first time in weeks, I saw real relief on their faces. A month later, Eastbridge Global renewed their contract, not because we begged them, but because Michelle Tan called me personally and said, "We want to work with leaders who know what they're doing. That's you." Other clients followed. Deals started closing again. Stability returned. The company didn't just recover, it began to thrive. Then came the final twist. The board invited me for a private dinner. I wasn't sure what to expect, but sitting there across from people who once viewed me as just another department head, I realized something had changed. They weren't looking at me as a placeholder anymore. They were looking at me as a leader. The chairman spoke first. "Claire, we'd like to offer you the permanent role of Vice President of International Operations. Effective immediately." I paused, letting that sink in. "I have conditions," I said quietly. He smiled. "Let's hear them." And I laid them out. Zero tolerance for nepotism in leadership roles. Transparent accountability standards for all executives. Full authority to build and protect my team, my way. The chairman nodded after each one. Agreed. I signed the contract. A week later, not for the title, not even for the raise, but because I wanted to ensure no one else would have to fight the same battles I did, just to be treated with basic dignity. And Nathaniel? The last I heard, he was working on some startup in Singapore, burning through his trust fund and trying to impress investors who saw right through him. Funny how that works. When you build your world on entitlement and fear, it collapses the moment someone refuses to play along. Looking back, I realized something. Nathaniel tried to destroy my career because I didn't follow his orders. Richard tried to sacrifice me to save himself. But neither of them understood the truth about power. Real power doesn't come from titles or threats. It comes from competence, character, and the people who trust you to lead them well. And that's something no spoiled heir and no cowardly CEO can ever fake.